An entire family here and then gone, like it was nothing at all. A family vacation abruptly ended by an unexpected visitor. A man and a victim with a dark history, and an ending that only left more questions. All this and more as we explore the anatomy of murder. July of 1968, a peaceful vacation area around Lake Michigan suddenly changed. A small group of women were having a fun time in their cottage, engaged deeply in a bridge party, but the laughter was soon extinguished by a heavy odor in the air that permeated their cottage, finding the smell so overpowering that they were unable to continue playing their game. The women did the only thing they thought they could. They called Chauncey Bliss, the area's caretaker, and expressed how powerful the foul odor was, and that they would hope he would investigate whatever it might have been and to dispose of it so the rest of their vacation wasn't ruined by the pungent atmosphere. Out in such a heavily wooded area, one may have suspected a dead animal, perhaps something large like a deer, and certainly close by, as the smell was overbearing. But the truth was much darker than that. The smell was actually trailing from half a mile away from another cottage, a cottage that contained a nightmare. At the next available opportunity, the caretaker took a coworker and examined the cottage which he had built some years earlier. It didn't take long for the two to know that something was very, very wrong. As he approached the cottage, he noticed holes in the glass of the windows. Peering inside, much to his dismay, he witnessed a human body on the living room floor, rotting in the summer heat. When they unlatched the door and opened it, the thick, putrid air hit them both intensely, as did the countless flies that had found their way inside the cabin. The horrible truth was soon realized. The family that had been staying in the cottage, their summer home, for an extended vacation, were all inside, dead. Richard Robison, his wife Shirley, and their 4 children, Richard Jr., 19, Gary, 17, Randy, 12, and Susan, 8, had all been violently murdered. To make matters worse, they had been in that cottage dead for nearly a month, decomposing with no one to check on them. The Robison family had been planning on leaving the cottage to take a trip towards Florida, so no one found it odd when the Robison family hadn't been seen in quite some time. The dead bodies had been repositioned and curtains had been drawn partially, and some precious items such as jewelry had been stolen. Richard's wife Shirley had been positioned to make it appear as if she had been sexually assaulted, but police believe that was only an attempt at misdirection and that Shirley was never sexually assaulted. As newspapers furiously printed the story, all anyone could wonder is why and how. Police investigation determined that whoever had killed the Robison family had come equipped with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, which they fired from outside of the cottage and through the window 5 times, aimed at Richard Robison, who was hit and dropped to the floor. The killer then wasted no time in bursting through the cottage's door and gunning down the entire family inside with a Beretta pistol. The killer then went on to take a hammer and bludgeoned Richard repeatedly with it, signifying a deep personal hatred for Richard. An act like this symbolized that this was more than just a random murder, but something premeditated, something calculated. Richard was chosen for a specific reason, but the killer wasn't finished. He took the bloody hammer then to 8-year-old Susan and beat her ruthlessly as well, her bones crushing and caving in the wake of each merciless strike. Leaving an entire family dead, the killer vanished into the darkness, and their bodies would remain until the caretaker had made the grisly discovery. Investigators frantically worked away, knowing with so much time having passed that their chances of catching their killer were greatly diminished. Around 2 weeks into the investigation, police began inspecting Richard Robison's business, and that was where they found their first lead. Richard was a very successful advertising executive and magazine publisher, and one of his employees was a man by the name of Joseph Raymond Scolar III, a man in his 30s who had been close to Richard. Joseph was known as a less than trustworthy individual, often involved in criminal activities, which he himself admitted to. Some of these activities involved stealing money from people and businesses. Some sources claim that Joseph was even embezzling money from Richard's company, despite the fact that Richard admired him, which set up a very clear motive for the death of Richard Robison. Needless to say, police kept a very close eye on Joseph, strongly believing that he was the murderer, but Joseph denied it at every turn. Police had Joseph take 3 separate polygraph tests, more popularly referred to as lie detector tests, and Joseph failed the first 2. The third was inconclusive. However, this proved nothing, as polygraph tests are not foolproof and often result in misinformation, which is why oftentimes results of a polygraph test are not admissible in court cases. Police continued to gather evidence and question witnesses. Aside from the bullet casings found at the scene, the bloodied hammer was also recovered. However, any chance of lifting fingerprints from the hammer was lost when an officer wrapped a handkerchief around the handle to hold the hammer up for a photograph, unknowingly rendering any fingerprints beneath it unidentifiable. Police determined that the murder had to have had occurred no earlier than June 25th. They confirmed that Richard was making phone calls to his business in the early morning of June 25th, sounding angry over what some assume was the discovery of Joseph embezzling money. Joseph left the office shortly after the phone calls and didn't return. Workers who had been trimming trees noticed the broken glass in the Robisons' windows when they were working the next day on June 26th. Police also questioned the neighbors, known as the Freemans, who were able to place gunshots on the evening of June 25th. But considering it was still a bit light out, they believed that the shooting was more recreational than murderous, so they never thought to call authorities. A murderous event that left an entire family dead and brutalized. But could it have truly been Joseph Scolar, an employee that Richard admired so much that he was considering cutting Joseph into the business itself, an employee that Richard gave a substantial raise to, boosting him from $300 a week to around $1,000 a week. According to Joseph, all these things were very well deserved, considering it was Joseph who ran the office while Richard took numerous trips to places like Hawaii and California. But there was one particular factor that launched Joseph into the spotlight as the prime suspect. The bullet casings recovered matched guns that Joseph owned, and a gun that he had purchased just a short time before the murders, a Beretta handgun. He gave this handgun to Richard as a gift and claimed that Richard had taken the gun with him to the cottage. Due to the rare type of ammo the handgun used, it was easily determined that the handgun was used in the murders of the Robison family. Joseph claimed to have given away his rifles, one to a friend and one to his brother. His friend's gun was accounted for in Chicago, but the one he claimed to have given his brother was never found. Things weren't looking good for Joseph Scolar, but there were some facts that just didn't add up. The drive from Richard's business to the cottage his family had been staying in was about 6 hours long. The gunshots were heard by the Freemans at around 9 p.m. on June 25th, but Joseph returned home by 11 p.m. that same night. It would have been impossible for Joseph to commit the shootings at 9 p.m. and return home by 11, and hiring a hitman on such short notice, though not impossible, was considered highly unlikely. Police just didn't have enough to go off of. The public was stunned by the murder. Richard was seen as a man without any vices whatsoever. However, the investigation might have proved otherwise. Richard wasn't the innocent victim so many people believed he was. The accounts from a number of people who Richard commissioned to do work for him refer to him as high-strung and mysterious. He often wore a bizarre medallion featuring St. Christopher on its face, with an even stranger inscription on the back, scratched unevenly into the metal, reading, "To Richard, my chosen son and heir, God bless you, Robert." To make matters stranger, unexplained letters were found in his office after his death, one of which was addressed to a Mr. Roberts, and expressed a desire to, quote, "be with you, my father." But that was only the beginning. In the Robisons' home, a chart was found, one that profoundly confused investigators. This is when police began realizing that Richard Robison had some big plan in the works that he was doing his best to keep a secret. On the chart was written the Superior Table, which was believed to have been the name of a secret organization that Richard was clearly a part of. Other members of the Superior Table had their names written down and were known as Mr. Thomas, Mr. Richard, Mr. Joseph, Mr. Peters, Mr. Martin, and of course the ever so mysterious Mr. Robert. A note accompanying the chart addressed those on the chart and was written by a woman named Sylvia, who claimed to be the personal secretary for Mr. Robert. The note was cryptic and unsettling.
The above shows the chain of power as decided by Mr. Robert, chairman-director of the Superior Table, the governed power of this worldwide organization which is solely set on complete peace and unity among all countries of the earth. Each of the above-mentioned directors will receive a complete organizational breakdown from our computer headquarters. If you have any questions, please direct them through proper channels.
Baffled, police turned to the Robinsons' closest friends to try to find an explanation. No one, from his closest friends to mere acquaintances, had any idea of what the chart or note was referring to. In fact, none of them had even ever seen it before. Investigators did their best to expand their search through the weaving paths of confusion and eventually settled on Richard's business. Richard may have been seen as an honest businessman publicly, but behind closed doors, investigators found just the opposite. It was discovered that Richard or his firm had been swindling thousands upon thousands of dollars from one of their major clients, Delta Faucet. According to the investigation, Richard had been overbilling the company on advertising space. Also, thousands of dollars appeared to also be missing from the company's account just months before the murders took place. But no one knew if Richard was a part of these things or was even aware of them at all. Suspiciously enough, the overbillings began around a month after Joseph Scolar, the prime suspect in the murder of the Robison family, was hired as part of Richard's company. When questioned, Joseph denied any involvement and claimed that Richard and his accountant were the ones who took care of all of the billings. When police questioned Richard's accountant, he refused to speak about anything regarding the business and remained tight-lipped regarding his job responsibilities. But the suspicious financial activities didn't end after Richard's death. They continued to a point where certain companies parted ways from Richard's company, and the reasoning was attributed to the practices of Joseph Scolar. Richard was also reported to have met with a number of people to discuss big business plans, secretive plans, that would have cost millions of dollars to fund, but apparently the investments weren't going to come from Richard's bank account or even his company's, but from a man known as Mr. Roberts. Richard approached two men who owned a small airfield called the New Hudson Airport named William and Arnold. Richard wanted to invest $11 million to develop an international jet port out of their small airstrip. Richard eventually left to stay at a nearby hotel. William and Arnold both received phone calls shortly after from the mysterious Mr. Roberts, who allegedly spoke in a rather unsettling, monotone voice, but it wasn't known if the voice on the other end was actually Richard disguising his own voice. But one thing was for certain: when Richard died, any trace of the elusive Mr. Roberts vanished. Police kept their focus honed in on Joseph Scolar. They always believed he was the one responsible, but all evidence was only circumstantial and insufficient to convict him of the murders of the entire Robison family. Joseph went on to live his life and bought out Richard's part of his firm, taking charge of the business and attempting to live something of a normal life. In 1969, Joseph was charged with receiving money under false pretenses, but the validity of the charges came into question as the charges were later dismissed. but the ruthless pursuit by the police and the enormous amount of stress that came with it simply was too much to bear. In 1973, nearly 5 years after the Robison family murders, Joseph neatly typed 2 notes inside his office. One proclaimed his innocence, stating, "I am a liar, a cheat, a phony, but I am not a killer. I am scared and sick. I did not kill the Robisons." The note went on to list people and businesses he had cheated in his life in a clear attempt to come clean. The second note was one to his mother, tacked outside of his office door, telling her not to enter. He sat down in his chair, leaned back, and put a .25 caliber pistol to the right side of his head, a weapon much like the one used to kill the Robisons, and squeezed the trigger, shooting himself dead in a bloody suicide. The mystery behind the Robison family murders went unsolved and still remains unsolved to this day, though many of those close to the situation have had their own beliefs on what truly occurred. One seemingly general consensus was that Richard and his family were all incredibly kind people, upstanding individuals who only ever benefited the lives of all those around them. All of their lives snuffed out one evening so many years ago. It's likely that the case will never be truly solved. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel for more content from me. Also, be sure to check out my last episode of Seriously Strange on shocking, unbelievable coincidences that actually happened. You can press on screen now or go into the description below, and there's a link down there for you. And I will see you next Sunday.